My name is Madison Stankiewicz, and I am an entomology PhD student here at UCR. And I'm really excited about our panelists today. I think that these people are doing some of the hardest and most important work in science and science communication. I think that diversity and inclusivity are important topics in science communication, mainly in a couple of different ways. First of all, when talking about the science communicators themselves, how do we make science and careers related to the communication of it an inclusive and accessible thing for people from all backgrounds and identities? And then on the other side of things, whenever we're communicating our science to a diverse audience, how do we do that? What does that look like? And what tools can we use to communicate what are sometimes complex ideas, or even whenever we just want to communicate the excitement that we feel about our own science to people from different backgrounds, identities, worldviews, beliefs, and knowledge bases from our own. So these are some of the things that I think we'll delve into today in the panel. And so I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists today, and then I'm going to have each of you just give a little spiel about what your interests are, what you do, and what motivates you. So first of all, right here we have Gustavo Arellano, and he is a pretty well-known writer. He's
whatever.
So you may recognize his writing from the LA Times or the OC Weekly. He has a pretty well-known column called Ask a Mexican, and he's also been on TV. He has books that he's written, and so sort of communicating what it's like to be a Mexican in this country, and sort of taking the approach of answering questions from non-Mexican people about what that's like. Yes, and then Kate Boersma is an assistant professor at the University of San Diego, and she's an aquatic ecologist who looks at invertebrates in aquatic ecosystems around Southern California and asks questions about community assembly and how that works. And she's also, she does a lot of work in diversity, in STEM, and really making sure that people from all walks of life and identities have a place at the table of science. So I think that's great. And then Mariam Lam is our Associate Vice Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer here at UCR. So she is really responsible for spearheading and running a lot of the programs and initiatives that we have here on campus related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, including some certificate programs, both for the graduate students and for the faculty members. I'm in the certificate program right now for the grad students that she's running, and it's been an important thing for me to be able to add some tools to my toolbox about how to talk and think about issues of diversity and inclusivity in academia and how to combat that in my own department. Yes, and then Terry McGlynn, he is the Director of Undergraduate Research and Professor of Biology at California State University, Dominguez Hills. And he's also a research associate in the Department of Entomology at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Terry studies ants, and he also does a lot of important work with mentoring and teaching. He writes in a blog called Small Pond Science with a lot of his advice and musings about teaching and mentoring, and he's coming out with a book in the next year that he's publishing based on a lot of that same work. And I forget the name of it, so you'll have to say that in your little spiel. So I'm just going to pass this along, and you can elaborate how you see fit.
Sure. Thank you all for having me, especially as the one non-science scientist here at all. But I do have a challenge for all of you when it comes to all the amazing work, all the amazing projects, all the amazing everything that you do. Your challenge is you want to get your story, or rather your story, your project being talked about by immigrant moms. I'm going to give you an example. My mom, she doesn't know 99% of the stuff that my publication, the Los Angeles Times, publishes. But she did find out about that story recently. That story recently that my colleague Ron Gongling wrote, that California has not had an earthquake in a very, very long time, and we're about due to one. And of course, we all know this, and this is a story that comes up every 5 years or so. But when he published that, my mom all of a sudden starts talking to me like, what's this earthquake that's gonna happen? Like, it's supposed to come very soon. I'm like, what, the big one? We've been talking about it my entire adult life. Yeah, but they just said it on the news. Did you read in the LA Times? No, they talked about it on Channel 34. So Channel 34, of course, being the Univision station here. And I thought to myself, oh man, that shows if she's talking about that. So I saw Ron at the LA Times Festival of Books recently in USC. And I said, hey, Ron, thanks to you, my mom's now worried about earthquakes. And then he's like, oh, your mom too? Because my mom's worrying about earthquakes as well. Because she had heard about it on Chinese language radio here in Southern California. And she said the same thing that I just said, that his mom does not read anything in the LA Times, doesn't really know what her child does except involves writing or whatever. And then finally something resonates that she didn't even know her son originally wrote. So when it comes to telling, and when I talk to these panels, like, I'm usually invited not so much about the diversity aspect, although of course that's very, very important to me as a child of Mexican immigrants, but more as a reporter who knows that all of you are doing amazing, incredible, groundbreaking things that are really going to affect us far more so than the entertainment or car chases of the world. But a lot of times they're just within your realm, within your worldview, and they don't really break over onto the mainstream side. So I think the important thing, and I'm sorry that I missed the previous panel because I would have been totally fascinated by hearing it, but is really about knowing how to get your research across. This is where universities fall in, sending out those press releases, but also knowing who are those reporters that are going to be interested in your stories. Of course, at least most newspapers should have a science reporter. At the LA Times, we actually have a lot of great science reporters. But it's not just knowing who exactly to talk to, but who are the people who could tell the bigger stories. So my job now at the LA Times, I'm a features reporter. My job is literally to go around Southern California and look for what are those stories that are going to make it into the ethnic press. The stories that I'm going to publish as a reporter, but then it's going to spread like wildfire, pardon the cliche, beyond what I did. And I'll give you a quick example, then I'll pass it over. I did a story in somewhat related science, definitely related to, just Southern California. I did a story about, we all know who Farmer John is, or what Farmer John is, beloved hot dog company here in Southern California. They have a butcher plant right there in Vernon. And so for the past 3 years, every Wednesday and Sunday nights, you've had activists go in front of the Farmer John's and feed water to the pigs that are going to be about to be slaughtered for 2 minutes. So what happens, you have these trailers, double-decker agricultural trailers filled with pigs, just totally squeezed in there. They stop before the gates because the truck driver has to fill out his forms and all that. And in those 2 minutes, Farmer John's allows these activists to give these pigs water. This is something that's been going around for 3 years. No one had ever told that story until I luckily stumbled upon it. Now it's slowly trickling. NBC Nightly News did something. La Opinión, the Spanish language newspaper, is going to do something about it. It's about, that's the job that I have, trying to find those stories. So if you have those stories that will resonate, it's your job to get in contact with me. It's your job to really sell yourself to the mainstream media that will then be able to tell your story or your findings across the world. Because obviously in your field, in your, among your peers, you all know what you're all working on. The rest of us, quote unquote, normal people, we don't know. But if we knew, we would be that much more interested in what all of you did. And, frankly, when it comes to certain segments of the government trying to slash all your funding, we're going to be a little bit more interested in trying to help you folks out when you actually need it. So that's what I do.
Woo. I'm on a hot shot panel here. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for the amazing work you do here. I feel like my representation on this panel is a mix of science communication, but also I do a lot of work to navigate diversity and inclusion issues within an institution that isn't always entirely supportive of that. I think that those of us who are in the sciences understand how much of a monoculture we exist in, which is a huge hurdle to effective science communication, right? And so there are multiple ways that we can go about diversifying, or whatever you want to call it, with the ultimate goal of having a science that represents our society, right? And now we're a long way from there. We're a long way from there, right? And I am early in my career, and I'm taking baby steps to navigate that with my colleagues, with my administrators, with my community, to emphasize just how important that understanding is. And this is coming from me, white lady, right? From a privileged background, trying to make these connections and trying to educate myself and continue to educate myself and educate my colleagues so that my colleagues of color don't have to do all that work. And so I think that hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about the role of people like me in this fight that we're in. Oh, and I'm an aquatic ecologist, and I love playing in desert streams, and I study climate change and drought. You can talk to me later about that if you want.
Thanks, Kate. So we're just supposed to talk about what we do, our work and our job, because we have a bunch of questions, so I don't want to take up too much time now. But basically, I've been faculty on campus for about 17 years, and the last 3 years I've been the Chief Diversity Officer. And on a campus that's lean like ours, which means I have a very small budget and a small office, it means I have to partner with all of the other senior administrators, deans, vice provosts, vice chancellors, and such to get traction to do different programming and for them to fund different kinds of initiatives across the campus. But it also means I have to work across all constituency groups, so grad students, undergrads, faculty, staff, and the larger community at large. And it also means that you have to not only respond to the needs of this large community, right? Everything from this diversity certification program that Madison mentioned earlier was something grad students asked us to do 3 years ago to initiate. They feel like they're often on the front lines with their undergrad students and with sometimes resistant faculty willing to do ADA accommodations for their students, right, or alternate exams for religious holidays and all of these things. And they also wanted more vocabulary and tools for not just their own teaching and how to navigate challenging relationships with their own peers and mentors and advisors, but then what they can bring with them into the profession, whether that's an R1, a community college, or nonprofit, or industry later, right? And so on top of that, I also go into departments when asked or invited to help deal with or workshop for challenging climates, right, which often lead to retention problems and attrition problems amongst faculty and grad students and such. And so that's sort of the general ballpark of my job.
Hi, thanks. Before I forget, so the book that I'm supposed to push is called The Practical Guide for College Science Teaching. It'll come out in about a year. So if you're hopefully help graduate students and other university level teachers avoid making mistakes that everyone learns from, maybe you can just learn them without actually making those mistakes. My context is, after working in a variety of institutions that don't quite get what it needs to be done, then I ended up at Cal State Dominguez Hills about 11 or so years ago, which is like about 10% white, about 30% not first-gen students. And so it looks like Los Angeles. It is Los Angeles in so many ways. So I actually have argued, well, I'm not really a science communication person, but people keep telling me that I am. And so, because I'm communicating about life and science to other scientists. So my blog basically is written for other scientists about issues in doing research and teaching and science and mentoring. And also when I'm on Twitter, which is probably how people more likely know me than for my blog, then that's the same thing. I talk about my audience is other scientists, and often I'll think about, and I think and talk about diversity, inclusion, and what it means to effectively engage with other scientists and junior scientists because it's my job, because literally that is the population that I serve. And also, as Kate's pointed out, is like, so, I'll deal with a lot of issues for women in science because it's not the job of women to fix a problem that men have created, but also at the same time for issues for Latinx, for Asian Americans, for African Americans, for, LGBTQ plus folks. It's a job for the folks like me who are the problem to reach out to my folk, to let them know what they need to do, that it actually requires active work. It's not just like being well-intentioned, right? The ally is like a verb and not a noun. And so we actually have to do things if it's going to make a difference. The identity of an ally is self-serving. It doesn't help at all. And so we need to communicate, well, how do you actually create institutional change? How do you transform the culture of an institution? And it's a lot of work. And so one thing Gustavo said that the first sentence out of his mouth made me like, oh, here's a little story I want to tell. The first thing he said is, he first said, oh, well, tell your story. And so, yes, indeed, all science communication, I think, is told when it's come from a personal perspective, but with a story. And so if we teach science as an aggregation of interesting, cool facts, it doesn't work unless it's in the context of a story that is engaging. And so part of thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and outreach, a lot of the barriers that my students face are from their own families and their own communities, and the disempowerment that they feel that they are not capable of making the changes or becoming the scientists that they're interested in being. And so one thing my department did a couple years ago, I was away on sabbatical, but I thought it was spectacular, as we had a family day. So we took a Saturday, and all the undergraduates and some of the master's students in our departments gave research presentations to family members. And it was kind of hilarious because almost all the talks were in Spanish, and most of the faculty in our department are not speaking Spanish. I'm, know just enough to embarrass myself for the most part. And so the students, before, all these students whose family members were just kind of humoring them about doing science, now the parents are like, oh, now I know I need to go to lab at night to feed the fish. Okay, now I know why you want to go travel to Indiana for the summer to do this, because now they're understanding what the research is and research is about, because they had their opportunity to tell their own stories to their own family rather than us tell it to them on our behalf. Okay, now I've talked too much, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I love that idea of a family day, and so I want to try to implement that in our department as well, and many other. We have lots of botany people here. I think that's a great idea. Your mom's here too. Oh, my mom's here. Shout out to my mom. Yes, love moms all over the place. Lorena, do you think you could get the slide up that has everyone's just contact information in case people want to follow you on Twitter or email you? Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So yeah, going off of what Terry was just talking about, and then also what Kate was saying about how the science we do in science and academia should really represent society, and the society that we're functioning within and working for to some extent, especially with taxpayer dollars. How do we bring people from more backgrounds and identities to the table of science? So specifically maybe in your own lab or department or campus, or magazine or anything. And then how do we go about overall, like you were saying, Terry, shifting the structure of academia, which is, a lofty goal, but I think it's necessary and doable. How do we shift that to be more equitable and focus on inclusive excellence, and not just excellence in science? And also, yes, I'll give this to you, but also if you guys don't have to go in order. Yeah, just saying.
Sorry, I just got really excited at this question, just because this is something that relates specifically to me. I think the most important thing for all of you as going in your PhD programs is mentorship, is really going to those elementary schools. And even just by your presence there, I cannot tell you how impactful that can be. Like I'm just remembering, I went to working class Latino everything in Anaheim. I can't remember if a scientist ever talked to me. I can't remember if in any of your fields, geologists, botanists, doctors or whatever. I remember in my junior high, in high school, growing up, like the only time we would ever get an adult to talk to us was the military, because that's the only career boys and girls with low GPAs have, or maybe police officers, or don't join gangs. That's what they would always tell us. Don't join gangs and don't do drugs. Now imagine the possibility if someone said, hey, I'm a scientist. And I'm not saying you even have to be necessarily a Latina scientist or someone who reflects like that, although that's also very powerful, but just someone saying, hey, this is what I do. This is what you can do. This is my own story. I learned this, and that. It does really make an impact. I only say this from personal experience where I've been speaking to high schools now, for a long, long time. And now to the point where now I get students who are young professionals who say, I saw you in high school at a conference and your words made an impact on me, thinking like, oh, wow, I could be a reporter too. And it's just I can't, if they tell me what high school I spoke at, then I'll remember it, but just something like that. And I especially know it's hard if you're a PhD student, if you're a professor, you all have a lot of work to do, a lot of research to do. But I'm telling you, it takes maybe maximum, especially if you just speak here in Riverside, 1 hour out of your day. You speak to the kids, you take their questions, and that's that. I mean, frankly, it should be a requirement for every PhD program to have you all go to elementary, junior high, and high schools and let those kids know, especially here in Riverside, that people of color, hey, this is what we do, and if we could do it, you can do it as well.
You want to go next?
Sure, okay.
I'll take it after you.
Okay. Okay, so what can we do? I think a lot of people don't understand what it takes because, they don't understand the lived experiences of others. So most scientists, most white scientists, have a background from primarily white institutions. So before I was working at Cal State Dominguez Hills, I was in I grew up in a lower income white suburb. I went to a primarily white high school. I went to a college that was celebrated for multiculturalism, but still pretty darn white. Then I went to Boulder for grad school. I think Mork and Mindy was filmed in Boulder. It gives you an idea of how white it is, right? And then I taught at Gettysburg College, which at the time was 98% white. Then I was another primarily white institution in San Diego, and then I'm at a place where it's like, oh my gosh, it just looks like Los Angeles. It's just not white, and it's been in education. I'd like to think that I'm not inherently ignorant, but there's always more to learn. And I don't think until visiting a place for a weekend or a week or a month isn't going to give you an idea of the kind of excellence that students will have. A lot of students, what I'm trying hard to do with other academics and other scientists is to make them realize that selectivity is often independent of academic excellence. The factors that people get selected into exclusive institutions don't necessarily have anything to do with their capacity to do amazing science. It's more likely to be correlated with their background. And so when people say inclusive excellence, people think that's like a buzzword. But indeed, by having a more inclusive environment, you have stronger teams that actually do better science. And that functional diversity, I study biodiversity, and ecologists talk all the time about diversity and productivity and stability and whatnot, but it's like we know that more diverse teams, especially once you add women to teams, do a better job, come to better decisions more promptly. So I think the way to get people on board is to actually make sure that they have those opportunities. So when I send a few of my students to go work in a lab elsewhere and they spend a whole summer working with those people, then they're like, oh, I want more of those students. Those students of yours are amazing. And I thought, well, those are kind of typical students of ours. They weren't the most amazing ones, but yeah. But the thing is, the stereotype is that if a student like my university is literally like non-selective, like we have not declared impaction. If you can meet the baseline criteria to get into California State University, you can go to CSU Dominguez Hills. Like if you don't get into San Bernardino, you could go to Dominguez Hills kind of thing. And we have amazing students, and it has nothing to do with our selectivity. And it clearly has nothing to do with the schools they've gone to in high school in LAUSD, frankly. And so, although we train a lot of teachers to go into LAUSD and they do amazing things, there's a lot of structural setbacks. And so, it's about personal relationships. And so people will advocate for individuals who they know. And so I think when people talking about allies, then I am an ally for other individual human beings, like this student of mine, this friend of mine, this institution I'm familiar with, then that's something I will advocate for. And so being a vague ally of a gender or a social class or an ethnicity or some repressed category doesn't connect with me. But on the same time, if we can gain experience with people with different backgrounds, then we can understand, then we have to change our template of what constitutes someone who is talented or someone who's excellent. And once you spend time with people from different backgrounds who are talented and excellent, then you don't have need for stereotypes. And so I just keep communicating about that stuff over and over again, and sometimes, people believe me.
I'll go after you.
So I love it that both Terry and I are on this panel because we work at very polar opposite institutions. So I work at a very expensive, very white private Catholic school. And so the changes that I am trying to make, I'm trying to work internally so that we can be more welcoming and increase our retention of those students at the college level, right? I don't feel comfortable going out into my community and recruiting a bunch of students from the local community until we have a place that can support their personal and professional development, right? That's the level that I'm working on. And it's funny that you just brought up the entrance exams and whatnot. At our department meeting last week, we were talking about SAT scores. And a lot of the junior faculty, many of whom are faculty of color, are interested in removing the SAT score requirement because data. Right, because correlations with class and parental education. I mean, the numbers are there, and yet we still have this cutoff. And I really appreciated some of the folks talking on the panel this morning to communicate that we're not special, that anyone can be a scientist, that there's not some bar, that we got some GPA in high school and therefore we're scientists. It's that we had a chance, and we knew we could try because of our backgrounds. And so when you're talking about how to increase the representation in academia and therefore affect our ability to communicate, I think that there are so many institutional changes in faculty mentality work that we need to acknowledge, that we need to do, these uncomfortable situations, these failures, that perspective that talking about diversity has no place in my science classroom, as if none of your students notice that every single paper you've read was written by a white male, as if they don't notice that, right? And so changing that culture, at least at a place like mine, is necessary in order to advance our cross-cultural communication capacity, I think. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So I have to tell you, this morning I came early so I could learn from this group, because prior to Lorena and Madison talking to me about science communication, I didn't realize there was a whole area of study and scholarship, because I think those of us who are not in the sciences kind of think of the sciences as this whole monolithic kind of entity that we know we're trying to diversify and all of that. But then the more I learned today, and the last panel that kept referring to folks like me as lay people, lay persons, I realized that what you're talking about is language accessibility, right? Communicating the sciences in an accessible, a specialized language into an accessible, digestible form. And so folks with my background in, say, comparative literature, post-structuralist theory, continental philosophy, we also can be charged with speaking jargon in a quite inaccessible language and such. And so I was thinking about Norm's comments this morning in his opening remarks about how he wasn't able to publish in the kind of popular journals and such until after he was secure sort of in his post-tenure and professional life. And there was a turn, in the last couple of decades toward public intellectual discourse, right? And that turn towards faculty and researchers making their scholarship more accessible to people, sort of spoke of two different things, right? A kind of advocacy of accessibility for folks who do not grow up having this language access, right? And then the other side of it is a resistance, a political kind of resistance to a kind of elite education. So notions that faculty and researchers are speaking in this kind of elite language that children in K through 12 who come from underprivileged backgrounds are not going to feel is welcoming or is not going to inspire them to go to that summer bridge program where they spend the summer with a bunch of professors who they don't want to spend the rest of their lives with, right? If they're not taken to Costo Hall and they don't see the other kind of student, racial, ethnic, gender diverse student programs, they're not going to even want to go to college, much less go get a PhD in a science field and spend the rest of their lives with these people in the lab, right? So I wanted to think about that briefly because part of the diversifying of the audience of the sciences is not only diversifying the space of the sciences and in the disciplines, but also the kind of how relevant the sciences are to these folks' lives, right? So when you give examples to pipeline building, K through 12 undergrad, grad stuff, if you're talking about why their local communities are dealing with environmental degradation, why the LA River Basin and the gentrification happening in that area has to do with these kinds of scientific aspects, right? This is going to make science more relevant to their immediate lives and the lives of their families and such. And so I wanted to think a bit about the language, and then finally a lot of what others have said on the panel and what Norm was talking to this morning and answering some of the questions from you all asking about, well, how come, my co-author faculty advisor keeps telling me to take out all the fun language and good stories and anecdotes out of my writing, and why can't Norm write that popular article until after he makes tenure, right? All of these kinds of queries are about real disciplinary climate change. So we know the reasons why higher ed is pretty homogenous, at whether it's straight white male, older, or what have you, is because of institutional historical structures that are deeply embedded in our system. And so many of the folks who have benefited and are in power positions within that system are, more inclined to keep the structures the same and not change them because it guards their own power. And this is where the real gatekeeping happens, right? It's not those of you who are in the field who are really pro diversifying higher ed and all of that. It's the folks who see diversity has no place in the sciences, right? Who see them as not inclusive excellence, but somehow bifurcated conversations. And so it really takes a conversation with those folks and how you should be crediting and valuing service work, diversity work in teaching and mentoring and in your research projects. It took us 8 years to change the academic personnel manual, APN 210, to actually include giving value and credit to faculty who are doing this kind of work in their merit and promotion files, because historically all the work people do in these kinds of things, from Jessica Tingle going back to her professional association and talking about diversifying her field, and then that association creating a subcommittee to work on these things, right? All of those kinds of efforts are about changing a larger systemic structural climate. So.
Great, thank you all for your comments. So going back to something that Kate said before, and also Terry talked about this too, being an ally and what does that look like and what does that mean? Terry was saying ally is a verb and not a noun. I like that a lot because I think that people sort of just place that label on themselves or others, oftentimes yourselves, to make you feel better. But like, yeah, what does that really look like? And as Kate was saying, it's up to some of us from overrepresented groups to do some of the hard work so that it's not all up to underrepresented groups to always be doing that. So what tips or advice or thoughts about that do you have about what it means to be an ally and like how to go about being an ally for those of us who really want to take that to heart and do that work?
Oh, okay. Here we go. Okay, there you go. No conversation. Just go straight to me. So a little bit more about the being a verb but not a noun. So at the Ecological Society of America conference a few years ago, they're distributing ally ribbons to put on your name badge, like, I'm an ally. And people are like, oh, that's a great idea. Well, first of all, identifying yourself as an ally doesn't necessarily mean you are. Like, just because you say that you're like a safe, supportive person doesn't mean that you are. And there are some actually predatory people that actually use that as a strategy. So there's no use to that label. But also, what does that communicate for every single person that does not take that label? Is that saying, well, I'm a person who's not safe, I'm not a person who won't support you when a push comes to shove? So those reasons I feel more iffy about that label. So I would classify ally work into two broad categories. One is like working to create structural change. So like Kate is working to transform her institution, for example. Other people might be working to transform their professional society. Other people might be trying to, work in local public schools or, with families or in local communities. And so that's like, it's just like any other kind of work. You put it into your schedule, you plan ahead, you have targets, you try to meet those targets, you fail to meet those targets, then you keep trying. And then the other kind of thing is doing the right thing at the right moment when the bad thing happens. When you see, as people call microaggressions or whatnot, when you see someone make a judgment that they shouldn't make an assumption they shouldn't be making, ask someone to make coffee because of their gender, for example, assuming a student can or can't speak a language, assuming that a person may or may not know something because of their background. And so when that happens, usually most people are like 10 minutes later, like, damn, I should have said something. But you don't know what to say at that moment. But also it's much, much more difficult, and there's a much greater social cost for the target of those comments to say something. So if someone says, something racist to a Mexican, then if the Mexican says, hey, that's uncool, you shouldn't say that, we're not all like that or whatever, then basically that person will like, oh, well, that person's judgy and uppity or whatever. But if the other person who is not a member of that group steps in and be like, dude, actually, that's uncool, then all of a sudden, that liberates that person from that, and they don't perceive that social cost of having to speak up for themselves, but also like the emotional wear and tear of having to exist in an environment which might be hostile. And so it's not just deciding to do this, but there's actually a set of skills. There's a thing called bystander intervention training, which I imagine happens on this campus that you could even request to happen. And it could be just like, a little 30-minute workshop, or it could be like a whole day or whatever. Or you can read things about how to intervene when you see something happen. And that's a tangible form of being an ally, so that you are mentally prepared. When this happens in front of you, people don't like hearing, 30 minutes later, oh man, I'm so sorry that person said to you. Oh, like out in the parking lot, right? No, you need to say it when it happens. And it's not easy, but frankly, it's our job.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So I want to echo all of that, but I also want to acknowledge how hard this is for those of us who are growing up from a privileged background. We don't even recognize what it would be like to have the Band-Aids not match our skin tone, right? Like that is something that does not, not all of us, right? But, the majority, we don't even see them. We don't even see our privilege, right? And so this is hard and it hurts. And so I think that the first thing that we all start with is self-education, right? And I think that's why folks are here, right? It's because we care about these issues, we care about science communication and how we do it. I feel like that's the afternoon panel. How do we do science communication? And for me, at least, I am constantly educating and constantly making horrible mistakes and recovering and learning and moving on. I mean, I think that you're gonna fail, and that's a part of this process. So, you interrupt in the horrible moment where your colleague says something racist, or your colleague talks over the petite woman in the department meeting, or whatever it is, right? There's that moment, and maybe the first couple times you'll miss it. And then later you forgive yourself, and maybe you talk to the person in the parking lot, right? But then you write down what you wish you would have said. And you take that notebook to the next faculty meeting, and you talk to your colleagues, and you talk about amplifying perspectives. And you read about how to take up space in meetings, and you read about how to present yourself and how to amplify your colleagues' voices. You do that self-education. For me, I'm never gonna get there, right? If you are in the majority demographic in this country, we can't ever get there. We are always going to be doing this work. I'm never going to understand what that's like. But acknowledging that, yeah, this goes in my schedule, right? This is something that is important enough that I'm going to plan a faculty reading group for every term so that faculty who are also doing that work, so we can do that work together, not with my faculty of color peers, because it's not their job. Some of them come anyway, right? Because they enjoy engaging in these discussions and recognize that it's important and whatnot. And of course, we welcome and appreciate the time that they give us. But I think that a lot of that self-education can happen now. And I also second the thought that using words like allyship or decolonizing your curriculum or being woke are dangerous. Especially when applied to oneself. So.
Okay. I think the best way, especially those of you who do come from privileged backgrounds in the sense that you're all, I'm assuming a lot of you are in doctoral programs, so that makes you very privileged, is to get power. Get power and then give it up and let everyone in. We talk about the mythical ivory tower. We talk about gatekeepers. I always imagine, you get past the gates and you tear down the damn gates and you're like, hey, everyone, come on in. That's like literally, that's what I did. That's what I've always done in my career. When I started at the OC Weekly, the paper that I edited for 6 years, I was the only person of color on staff. And this is not that long ago. This is 2006. Orange County, mythical white bread Orange County, has been majority minority since at least 2004. Growing up, actually, I didn't realize there was a lot of people in Orange County until I got into community college in 1997. Because growing up, I'm like, oh, I thought everyone was Mexican, and if they weren't Mexican, they were all immigrants. Even the quote-unquote white kids were Romanian and Polish refugees, from the Soviet bloc countries, because I grew up in the 80s. But so when I was at the OC Weekly, I was a token everyone. I wasn't just a token Mexican. I was a token African American. I was a token Vietnamese. I was my Muslim friends are like, you're the best Muslim reporter in Southern California. I'm like, but I'm Catholic. But they're like, but you tell this is like during the Iraq War. They're like, but you actually treat us as humans instead of terrorists all the time. And for me as a reporter, it's a little bit different because ultimately for us, it's all about the story, and it doesn't matter what nationality you are as long as you're able to tell the story. But for me, it's like, my colleagues are not telling the stories of the real Orange County. They're only telling the stories of their segment of Orange County that is that they see through their lenses. So for me, I want to see all of Orange County. So to make a very long story short, I ended up becoming the editor of OC Weekly. I resigned in 2017. That's a whole other story. But by the time I left the OC Weekly, the paper was majority people of color. And I didn't do it for myself as like an affirmative, like consciously an affirmative action hires. For me, it's like, can you tell stories that other people can tell? If you can, and you're amazing, let's bring you in. And you happen to just be a person of color? Okay, cool. Let's do it that way. And also, as I've gone on in my career, I've been very lucky to be able to, at this point, I just joined the LA Times in December this past year. I did most of 2018 as a freelancer. By the end, people were coming to me hey, do you want to write for us, Wall Street Journal? Do you want to do an essay or do this, and that? And I say that not to brag, but to do this, where at some point, like, well, I can't really do it, but here, I know a great writer who you should be hiring. In fact, like, I just had this shameless plug, but we just released a package, Eater.com released a package about Mexican food in the United States. Like, huge package. Eater.com, it's like one of the best websites devoted to food. They have specific chapters or specific publications for each city. So for instance, there's Eater LA, Eater Portland, this and that. So this multi-city effort, we ended up doing like 80 stories, amazing package. And I was a guest editor on that. I did one story, but I was more excited on being able to bring up young, and not just Latina or Latino voices, but different voices from across the country to get them connected with a publication that the publication doesn't know that they need their voices, and those voices don't know that they can get to that publication, but you need to be that bridge. And the only way I would have been able to do that, again, is by using the power that I have, the notoriety that I have, and the connections that I have to help out other people. All reporters do want to keep their best stories, of course, and of course I keep the best stories for myself. That said, I hand out a lot of stories, and I always have done that. I don't know your science community completely well to be able to say this, but I'll just say, if you're anything like journalists, you should not be just jealous of all your opportunities and jealous of all the connections that you have. Give them away. If you're really that talented, that's not going to hurt you at all. If anything, it's going to help you. But if you give your opportunities away and you find yourself lesser and jealous than the other person, well, that's on you, and frankly, you don't deserve all the privilege you have.
I wanted to ask Kate what she meant at the end of her comments by, these terms like being woke, which Alex used on the last panel, and decolonizing your education and stuff, which I use quite a bit, why they're dangerous and such. But so in my line of work, the notion of allyship is potentially problematic because historically, folks in sort of social movements and activist circles and such get very frustrated when allies make it all about themselves, right? Then you hear these other terms like white savior complex, white privilege, white fragility, and that can be male privilege and all of that also, but that there's this tendency to focus on the allyship itself as some sort of thing you need to give credit to and kudos to, and then it all becomes about your role in the effort, in the larger effort, when a lot of the activists have turned to notions of accomplicemanship or accomplice personship, right? That it's better if you act as an accomplice in understanding the structural systemic problems, and that space of the classroom where you stand up for that person who feels offended by that microaggression, that you're doing that because you understand the actual power dynamics in the room, and you as a senior colleague can do that, or you as somebody post-tenure, a senior advanced grad student, has the authority and power to do that intervention, right? That's a notion of kind of accomplice personship. I think the other tendency is that in the space of classrooms and such, people get very nervous about how much advocacy they do or what they can say as a white woman, because we know from history that affirmative action benefited white women more than folks of color and such, right? That's just the history. And structurally, well, then if I come off as too much of an ally or something, are my folks of color in the room going to kind of resent me as being that white woman, right? And so there are all these kinds of interpersonal negotiations that we have to do, and that kind of cultural contact work, and then there's the kind of allyship of understanding the structural impediments that create the disparities and structure our interactions with one another.
Yep.
Oh, yes.
I just wanted to follow up. That's a great comment. It is about white savior complex. That's exactly what it's about. And it's about us labeling ourselves as allies to advance our own goals. I actually, in preparing for this, I read this blog by a woman named Nayantara Sheeran Appleton, who talks about decolonizing academia and decolonizing the curriculum. And she had encouraged white faculty, instead of saying, here's my decolonized syllabus, when they added one learning outcome about something cultural, right? Instead, to work on diversifying your syllabus, digressing from the canon, decentering knowledge and knowledge production, devaluing hierarchies, disinvesting from citational power structures, and diminishing some voices and opinions while magnifying others. So I think that it was coming from this place of like, the work's not done, right? I'm not gonna get this woke stamp and then be done, because as someone from a lot of privileged demographics, the work is gonna be going forever.
Thank you so much for clarifying that, and I really enjoyed that discussion, and I particularly like what you were, all of you were talking about like if this work is important to you and these topics are important to you, it's good and okay to make goals and work towards those goals in the same way that you do your science work, maybe here in the lab or whatever. Like, I think some people are like, you know, you have to schedule your days with your meetings and your lab work and everything, and then whatever else is important to you, you just sort of like do that on your off time. And you know, these are very important topics, and I think that to take them seriously, it's important to schedule it just like you would with the rest of your work. And I think, you know, you guys all do a great job of that, but I really enjoyed that comment. And then, oh, and also this whole discussion, I feel like can apply to all aspects of life and not even just science or science communication, but to bring it back a little bit to the science communication. So Gustavo, you have demonstrated this a lot throughout your career of storytelling, but also Mariam was talking about this earlier, how it's important to make science relevant to the lives of the people who you're trying to connect with, and just the lives of everyone that makes up our community and our society. And so what tools and techniques do you all use to make science understandable to people from a wide range of backgrounds and people that don't necessarily look or think like you?
I'll stay out of this one.
I have a thought. Okay. I have a couple thoughts. Okay. So my background is partially in animal behavior, and so there are whole chapters in textbooks about what is communication and how can you define what communication is. And so essentially, communication is goes both ways. So if you're just sending information out, that's not communication. That's signaling. And so especially as like, you know, a senior tenured bald old white dude, for me to do science communication in the context of DEI means listening. And so if I'm saying something, if I have a point to make, then that means I need to listen. And so, but I think what I tried to do is to not necessarily have a point to make, but have a topic I want to discuss and say, here's what I think about this topic. And I'm not charging people to tell me how I'm wrong, but I'm like, I think this is a conversation that matters. I've noticed, for example, in the context of communicating with other scientists, should the GRE be a requirement for being admitted to graduate school? And I'm not gonna say, okay, it should not be or whatever, but like, you know, actually, it looks to me like this is a barrier, and I think it's inequitable. Can we talk about that? And then we have a conversation. And so I'm trying to use this platform that I've built to build a conversation that other people can see. And also, especially, I think part of one of the ways that I tried to communicate and make science clear to broader audiences is when I'm particularly on Twitter, if you're wrong, then people will tell you that you're wrong very quickly. And so it's a great opportunity for learning. Also, people might tell you that you're wrong when you actually might not be. So you need to have a fine-tuned sense of and a good moral compass and understand where people are coming from. But still, if I think good science communication involves a two-way conversation. And so in the context of blogs, then people write comments and there's conversations on social media. And for me, I think I have gotten far more from using Twitter than I have given, because there's a whole community of people that I've learned from, like was mentioned by someone before. It's like, oh my gosh, like I've just learned so much from just listening to Black Twitter, just not even interacting, but just listening and seeing what people are talking about. You can understand where people are coming from. So that way, if I am going to talk about my science, if I'm going to talk about ants, if I'm going to talk about climate change, then at least I can see what matters to other people.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we talked a little bit at my lunch table when we were practicing our spiels about the hook and the importance of your hook. And I think that another piece of this is recognizing that your hook's going to change based on your audience. And that's this listening piece, right? What do folks care about? If you come in with a message that is truth, because we're scientists and we know everything, right? And you're not listening, well, then no one's going to listen to you. Why would they? You don't value their opinions. Why are they going to value yours, right? So I think that hook, having something, and hopefully you, as a scientist, know a whole bunch of hooks about your research. You know why, in my case, I study water in the desert. I know how that's going to affect, how that rolls into environmental justice, how that rolls into agricultural production, how that rolls into drought and climate change, how all of these pieces are connected, which is why I'm so fascinated by it, right? It has all of these social and cultural elements, and it has which particular stonefly species lives under that particular rock, right? And so I think by doing this listening, that's how we engage folks. Less talking, more listening.
Yeah.
The hook for me this morning was when you started talking about fecal transfer, because I didn't know that was an area of scholars. Sorry, that's all.
Yeah, know the audience who you're talking to. I speak to kindergartners, I speak to senior citizens, I talk to far left groups, I talk to far right groups. I always think that my message is the same, but I know how to tailor it to different people. But really quickly, I think what you have to do to get your message or your hook across, you have to talk to people who don't look like you. And what I mean by that is talk to people who are not scientists. Talk to all sorts of folks. I have a great example here with Norm. Norm, I'm glad to say, he's a good friend of mine and my wife and his wife as well. And he got in contact with me years ago, not even to do a story, just like, hey, I'm a fan of yours. I know you like food. By the way, my wife, Tracy, runs a citrus collection. I didn't even know the citrus collection existed. So we go, of course, you're like, oh my God, it's amazing. And over the years, we wouldn't, we'd go out to eat because him and Tracy, they're big food fans. So we'd go around different places in Southern California. So just in conversations with Norm, I learned about Asian citrus-silid disease. And so what happened, sometime last year, I get a notice from the state of California, the Department of Agriculture, hey, by the way, the citrus-silid is here in your neighborhood and we want to do a check of all your citrus trees. I have like 13 or 14 citrus trees. And so instead of me being angry or upset, oh God, the government's here, screw you, I'm not gonna do that, I knew exactly what the stakes are. And I said, hey, come on in, check everything. And I was able to write a column about it for the LA Times, because I used to be an opinion writer for them all of last year. And I got a lot of good positive feedback from people saying like, oh, that's what it is. How can I get, I think I have it. Who do I get in contact to? And I would send it out. And I would have known, and this is me as a food writer. I knew nothing about this disease. I knew nothing about how existentially dreadful it is towards citrus everything. And if you're from Southern California, citrus is like your real, Mexican food and citrus are your real gods here in Southern California. To the idea of what Southern California is, I would not have known about it if not my friend Norm had just told me, not even offhand, but just like, oh, by the way, this is something that we're fighting in. So even simple conversations like that, it really just helps communicate to people why desert are, why ants are important, why water in the desert are important. Just on a regular person way of doing it. I know I'm very inarticulate right now, but that said, if you know that hook, and this is, I guess, since you're all in university departments, all your schools have a communications director, and a lot of schools usually have a communications director for your department. That's where you go to the communications director, whoever's in charge of being your hype man or hype woman, go out there and say, hey, I'm doing great work. Go get the LA Times on me. Go get the New Yorker on me. Go get this, this, and that. And if they're going to say, oh, no, I can't do it, they're like, no, that's your job to do. That said, you better be ready to be able to say what's the amazing work that you're doing. And all of you, again, I cannot overemphasize how all of you I know are doing amazing work, but it's your job to let the world know. The world can't come to you. You have to go to the world.
Thank you all. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. And so maybe we can do a similar thing where you write your questions down on paper if you don't want to raise your hand, and I'll be sure to ask a couple of those this time. So if you have any questions, write them down. But in the meantime, would anyone like to ask a question? Who's a hand raiser type of person?
Louder.
No questions.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Okay. Yes, Norm.
So I'm old, I'm white, I'm male, and I would like to be a better, do better for diversity. So what can I do to change my ways as a scientist to be the best I can be?
Yeah, go for it. Or I was going to start with.
Okay, well, that's a really long list. I think one of the be informed and be on hiring committees, be that reasonable voice, and so it's the pipeline problem is an active filter is the real problem in the pipeline. It's not necessarily people, whether or not they get these opportunities. There are plenty of talented people. They just need to have that talent identified. Another thing is choose who you collaborate with. When you write a grant, who are the co-PIs on this grant? When you are the co-PI, who's going to be the co-PI? Who's going to be the first author on the paper that you're writing? Who are your middle authors? What students do you bring into your laboratory? What speakers come into your department? Never be the first person to ask a question. Oops. Well, there's like nice long pause there, right? So I think that was perfectly legit in this case. Gave everyone else an opportunity to ask the question. And so, see who you choose to spend your time with on a regular basis, frankly. And make sure that your peers know that they're valued and demonstrate that. And it's a lot of the things that are not necessarily visible. There are people that you could advocate for that they would never even know they're advocating for them. Oh my gosh, when you're on a grant panel, there is so much implicit bias that once you look out for it, so how you serve on a panel. When you write broader impacts into your proposals, are you funding activities that fund DEI? At least for the National Science Foundation in biological sciences, only about 15% of funded broader impacts actually are towards broadening inclusion. People think, broader impacts usually involve, diversification and stuff. But actually that's not true. That's just a stereotype. Or at least those things usually don't happen. There's a paper that came out by Nalini Nadkarni about 6 or 7 years ago that showed that. And so there are so many things that we can do, but it's just making a part of our regular life every day.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think it's not any one particular thing you can do, even though that's a great list to start with. I think the good thing about UC Riverside's approach to diversity, equity, inclusion work is that it's not up to my office to do all that work. It's everybody's responsibility, right? So that's why everybody's supposed to be an ally or accomplice, right? That it's your job as a faculty member, as a grad student instructor, as a member of this community to make it as hospitable and safe a learning environment as possible, right? So that means you're the one, if you're the best role model at your department meeting, you're the one de-escalating that tense moment, making sure everyone feels heard, giving the cultural lesson or asking certain people to do it, not the most minoritized person in the meeting, right? All of that kind of modeling behavior contributes to how everyone else will behave in this given space. And so I think part of that work is so holistic. So when we talk about inclusion, it's not just about including different heads of the 4 racial food groups in the room. It's about making everybody feel included and welcomed, so that the oldest, straightest white man in the room isn't afraid to ask that question about gender pronouns or, gender binary, non-binary bathrooms and all of that, and inclusivity, and that the most minoritized person in the room also is not going to be afraid to speak up and say that statement was really offensive to me, right? So everyone does their part in crafting that environment.
All right. So I have a question from the fishbowl here. And the question is, where is the biggest change of culture needed? In science communication, education, policy, or at home, or possibly any other place? And just like sort of to add on to that, I guess like where do you think is the most important place for this conversation and action to start? Or maybe all of those places, because we haven't really talked about like the environment at home or even policy, which is really important to science and science communication too.
So I almost said this earlier when I was talking about how uncomfortable some of this work is. Play to your strengths. We're not all going to be good at Twitter, right? Or we're all not going to be good at that radio interview. But we are good at something. So as long as we fit this as a priority in our sphere of something, we'll play to our strengths. We'll be better at it. We won't feel so completely overwhelmed, just moderately uncomfortable like we're supposed to feel, right? And so I don't think you need to force yourself to be a different person. Just play into that wheelhouse you already have. Just push yourself a little more to start.
No, I was just going to say, I think Terry mentioned it earlier, but I think hiring committees and then retention issues, climate issues in the department are still the biggest barriers in sort of diversifying science and higher ed as a whole, because not just the gatekeeping, but because there's so many places in which unconscious bias plays out during the hiring process and such that don't get intervened in the moment. And what Terry said, they don't just talk about it 30 minutes later. You hear about it like 3 weeks later when the short list has already been created and the person's coming. And so I think the training we've been doing in sort of non-confrontational call-outs and such, that work needs to be immediate in the space of the climate of the department and during the hiring period.
Thanks. So in the realm of science communication, there's somewhat of a celebrity culture, which I don't necessarily think is a negative. In other words, because science communication involves stories, but really when people connect with science communicators, that's because you're connecting with those people and those personalities. And so if you think of it's like, for example, like one of the reasons I like the Brain Scoop is I think Emily Graslie is awesome. One of the reasons I like Ologies, I think, is that Allie Ward is really funny and super cool and engaging, for example. And one of the reasons I'm not into Neil deGrasse Tyson, but never mind. So I think we need much more diverse voices as the public face of science. And actually, we have them. We have many diverse voices who are the face of science, who communicate science very excellently, but they're not getting picked up by like major TV channels, or Netflix, or their podcasts aren't getting as big of an audience, or they're not getting as many YouTube subscriptions or whatnot. And I don't necessarily know to fix that, but I think in the world of science communication, I think we need faces of many colors and people from many different backgrounds communicating science to show that everybody does science and that science is for everybody. I don't know how to fix that, but for me, I think if we're thinking about science is often perceived as being a really, really white thing, some fields more than others. But in general, that's the public perception. And that's because that's who they see in that white lab coat is a white person. I think that takes some real focus and structural change and work for us as other scientists to pay attention to and look at other faces.
Just on that last note, Gustavo might actually have more to say about this, but the U.S.'s biggest foreign export is culture. So it's the entertainment industry, like the last panel. And that is where a lot of these stereotypes of who's in the white lab coat and stuff get perpetuated. And so...
No, I know how to fix that. You all have to be like Lucy Jones. Lucy Jones has been probably the most famous scientist in Southern California. I have known her. I don't know her personally at all. I would love to meet her. I think she's totally cool. But I've known her my entire life because when there's an earthquake, there she is in the white lab coat, white woman with a bowl cut haircut. Back in the days, I think it's a little bit better now. But the reason she's on television is not so much because of her position, but she knows what she's talking about. And she's able to speak to the masses, to the people who, like, it's funny because here I am, I'm the reporter, but my viewing or media consumption habits are of like an 89-year-old person. I still watch network news. I still watch Channel 9 News. I don't know podcasts. I don't know YouTube channels or anything like that. So I'm literally listening to what the masses of Southern California, or at least older masses, are. And so with Lucy Jones, it's like, it's right to the point. It's straight to that. You might not all be good in an interview. Well, guess what? Teach yourself how to be good in an interview. All of you should have those media communication stories so you become the go-to authority, not just locally, but nationally, when someone from the Wall Street Journal is like, oh, I need a really smart scientist on the desert. Like, let me go find this person. Or first of all, who would that person be? You gained that reputation for yourself. Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, all the people that we know, they were very savvy at learning how to hone their message to be smart for media consumption. And doing that and how do you do that? You just train. I'll give you a quick example, then we'll go to it. When I first started being on the radio, this is a long time ago, I was terrible. I spoke how I usually speak with my friends. So a lot of ums and uhs and all that. So when I would hear myself on the radio the first couple of times, I would just wince. I'm like, oh my God, I sound like an idiot, like a complete idiot. That's not to say I'm not an idiot, but if you're on the radio, you're not supposed to sound like an idiot. You're supposed to sound studied and learned. So what I would do before any interview, I would just write down this. Don't say then the words I did not want to say. So basically, and that's actually one of the words that you should not say. And as well. You see, I'm talking like a normal person right now. You don't want to say filler words like basically, essentially, I mean, I know, you know, whatever. I would write that. I would underline them. It's almost like a device, a mnemonic device or whatever. And don't say whatever either. Put them in quotation marks, circle it, underline them. Within a month, I eliminated that to the point where obviously here I'm talking a little bit more normal, but if I'm on radio, the reason I get called on to be on radio again and again and again is because people know I will go short, sweet, to the point. I will not use filler words. And if I ever do use a filler word, I immediately log it in my mind like, oh, damn it, I was not supposed to say that word. But that did not happen without lots and lots of training. All of you are able to do that, all of you, but maybe not all of you want to put in that hard work, but then that's going to distinguish the people who just labor in obscurity to the Grassy Tysons and the Lucy Jones of the world.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so another question. How can we use science communication to make science more inclusive for individuals with disabilities? So these are things like mental health, chronic conditions, being deaf or blind, things like that that are not necessarily tied to your privilege.
I think that a part of that is being visible. Not the folks with disabilities, the folks who care. I think that signaling, I meant to mention this earlier, that signaling's really important for some demographic groups, especially often hidden minorities, disability, LGBTQ community. I use my water bottle to signal a lot in classes. I have stickers on my water bottle, and if you are in a demographic that is a hidden minority, that you'll know what that symbol means on my water bottle. And everyone else will wonder why I have that pink and light blue and white sticker on my water bottle, right? And so I think that that acknowledgement. Also, a way that I've found just in my classes is to seek feedback before the term starts. And I know that we're talking about public engagement and not in coursework, but I'm a field ecologist, so accessibility is an issue in my courses. I teach field courses, right? And so I send an email before the term, and I ask folks to tell me their pronouns. And I also ask if there are any accessibility issues or something that I can, because I'm happy to modify my syllabus to make sure that everyone can take my course. I don't know if that's the right approach, so that's the approach I use.
Right. So there's, I only recently have become acquainted with this, with the concept of universal design. So that when you are, so when I'm teaching in class, and also when I'm doing any kind of outreach or public writing, or if I'm on social media, I design it so that it would not offend anyone in any particular kind of marginalized category. I think, what some people call political correctness, I just think is, respecting the opinions of others, right? And so, so for example, if I'm posting something on Twitter that includes an image, then there's a place to include the written description of what is in that image. And so I don't know if any blind people are going to be seeing what I put there, but if there are, then they're going to see a little metadata description of what that is. So if I'll post an animated GIF, then I'll have a short description of what that is, for example. Or if I'm uploading something onto the learning management system for my course, then I'll do the check to make sure that it's machine readable. Even though, I don't think anyone in my class necessarily has these, as visually disabled, at least I would make sure that's the same way. But also likewise, I'm trying to be more careful about my language. So for people who have mental illness, some of them have issues when people refer to something exciting or weird as cool as crazy. It's like, oh my God, that's crazy. It's like they'll say, well, that's an ableist slur. Now, some people who are mentally ill, they're like, oh, you can say that, I don't care. But some people do care, and some people have told me they care. And so I'm trying to avoid that kind of ableist language on a day-to-day basis every time I say something like that. And the more I listen, the more I identify how I can make sure that if I'm interacting with the public, if I'm interacting with someone who I'm not incredibly intimate with, that I will interact with them as if they could be in any one of these categories for which universal design is necessary.
I'm just going to say I'm really happy somebody asked that question, because I think disabilities is one of the areas that gets the least amount of visibility and talk and conversation and communication around it. And so especially a field like science communication can be so helpful to an area like that. We just started at UCR a task force, a committee of faculty and staff working on we already have a student disability resource center, but many faculty don't know that even the process is, people are still going up to their students asking for doctor's notes, which is illegal, right? They don't know that the student disability center mediates a lot of students who are registered in advance, and then that center communicates with the faculty or instructor, right? And so there's a lot of just lack of knowledge around this stuff. But then in terms of, say, everything from universal design to the kinds of ableist language, right? We try not to say blind folks, but we say people with disabilities, right? Or people with visual impairments and all of that. And so a lot of that kind of communication needs to be taught. We need to be taught and explained to why it's best, even though we were all trained to make exciting PowerPoint presentations, the most accessible ones are white background with big black font, right? And if you have a visually stimulating PowerPoint presentation, make sure you also have PDF tear-outs that people can take away that have these things, right? And a lot of that could use the benefit of having science communicators really explaining the needs and the reasons behind a lot of the efforts.
Great comments. Thank you so much. So I think we're going to have one more question, which is really two questions that sort of go together. Well, we'll see. We have about 15 minutes left. So one of them is, with communication platforms becoming more and more global, what do you think is the best platform or tool to reach out to diverse and global audiences? And then the other question is, what is the global challenge you see in science communication? So yeah, we've talked about a lot of things on the local scale, but if you have any insights on the global scale, we'd love to hear it.
I think just for platforms, if you want to put your message across on social media, everything has a different audience. y'all are doing, work with science work. I mean, we're in this beautiful botanical garden. So if you want to talk about this, the place to do it is Instagram. Big, beautiful pictures, a couple little words here and there. And of course, if you're able to see these images, then that's instant language right there. If you want to have actual, I don't know, for me, Twitter is more for a place for comedy and for rants and whatever. I don't, but you can have very interesting conversations though with people. Like I always have, this is vaguely related to science. This is more etymology, but every once in a while, I'll just put the hashtag up, Mexican names or Mexican nicknames. And, I just like old school Mexican names based on Catholic saints, Greek gods, or whatever. There's some really interesting ones out there. And the audience just starts reacting. And it's a good, honest, fun conversation. With Facebook, I just think that's a little bit more people that you actually know in real life. And that's where you could have a little bit more spirited debate. YouTube, that's where you just get up there and just start spouting off whatever rambles you may have. Again, it's all about knowing what your platform is. And in this day and age, and frankly, you don't need people like me anymore. In some ways, you don't need the media anymore to communicate your message. That said, if you want to be the media, you better know what your message is and you better know how to throw it out there. We're still useful in the sense that we have a little, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely. I've actually been saying this for media folks forever that frankly, we deserve the, I always mix my metaphors. So we deserve the grave we buried for ourselves just because we didn't pay attention to how we could effectively reach communities out there. And so the community, especially when it comes to community of colors, communities of color, we would not represent them. So those communities are like, screw you, media, we're going to do our own thing. And here we are. So I think now more than ever, you have the tools to be able to put that message across globally, whatever message you may be. For people like myself, I'm looking for those great stories just to, frankly, still have a job.
Did you want to comment? Yeah, I just have a quick wanted to follow up and say that I think a lot of us are ignoring mainstream media outlets and not using I don't know who you were gesticulating to, but the publicity office here of our universities. And I think that those press releases for our science are still really important. And this is something I personally am bad at and am working on, right? That as awesome as social media is, it's limited. And I switched to Instagram, actually. I am not as much on Twitter because the visual medium seems to work for me better. I'm a photographer, and so that's a play to my strengths thing. But I do think, I appreciated your comment also about learning to use different forms of media and understanding what your audience is and who needs to hear your message. And I think that we need a diversity of sources in order to reach a diverse audience. Mm-hmm.
Based on your discipline and based on the audience you want to reach. So for my fields of scholarship, it's very helpful to keep up to speed and keep up to date with my colleagues in other parts of the world on Facebook because they interact globally that way. When you're trying to keep up on politics in certain parts of the world, Twitter is often very helpful because they have censorship in other spaces in the world, and we do here also, but many people will take to Twitter. I accidentally made the mistake of saying I'd never twat before, and my students were all over that one. So, but I think the different social media outlets can be helpful for specific goals.
Right, yeah, play to your strengths. So I would say one thing I find amazing about being on Twitter and reaching a global audience and whatnot is that, like, I'm just like this dude who publishes papers once in a while. He's a professor at California State University, Dominguez Hills. But I get called by reporters regularly to ask me to comment on studies. Oh, what's this thing about insects? I was on I forget what media outlet last week. They called me because they wanted to talk about global insect decline because a paper came out, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, and the reason they're contacting me is because they know that I'm like an ant-insect person on Twitter. And so reporters are really often and busy on Twitter. And so I've got that magical blue check saying I'm verified, which they give more frequently to men, which is entirely messed up, by the way. So that means reporters see me, and so I often will refer them to someone else, but sometimes I'll take it myself. And so in terms of actually reaching out through traditional media, I don't know how often reporters are looking at YouTube or Instagram or Facebook or whatnot, but for me, at least Twitter has provided that kind of access. And then the other thing I thought I would mention it. And so a very specific answer to the question about what are science communication challenges. Generally speaking, obviously, global climate change. And I think the particular challenge that we face is that the urgent action that we need right now is to governments to make change. And so scientists need to work with the general public to make sure that we have the understanding for the urgent need for this change. And so this essentially is basically scientists need to get political. So I think one challenge is that scientists think, oh, I don't want to talk politics, I just want to talk the science of climate change. But if we're really going to fix this problem, then we need to actually, Congress to do something. But also, I think the associated challenges is that there are huge amounts of money coming from the fossil fuel industry to convince us that it's our fault because we're not making individual changes in our own lives, but really it's structural change that needs to happen. I mean, driving a fuel-efficient car is a great thing. Having a meatless diet is a great thing, but making individual changes isn't going to move the needle on global CO2 as if we were to have massive fundamental things like, say, the Green New Deal. And so scientists are not engaging in this as much as we need to, and science communicators are afraid of alienating with their audiences with getting political. But if we're going to have a habitable planet a couple hundred years from now, we got to do that.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a great gift that you took your time and were here today and were sharing with us. And I think that we're all a little bit better off than we were before this discussion, just because we were all a part of it and we could hear all of your thoughts on these really important issues. So thank you for the work that you do and for being here. Let's give them a round of applause. All right, and I think we're going to have some closing remarks.
Around for a bit so that we can get a group photo with you, the speakers, and the audience. So just hang on a little bit after the closing remarks. Thank you. Yes, of course.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Becky Mackelprang. I finished up my PhD at UC Berkeley in December 2017. And as a grad student, I was super fortunate to be able to be part of the science communication group. The group was called CLEAR, which stands for Communication, Literacy, and Education for Agricultural Research. It took me like 2 years to memorize that. What an acronym. And then when I graduated, my advisor for that science communication group got some funding to hire a postdoc to do science communication and outreach for a year. So I was so fortunate to be that person, and I've been fully engaged in spreading the good word of science for the last year. So we have heard some great speakers today, and I want to give everybody about 20 seconds. Just think about why you came here today. What were you hoping to get out of this? Maybe you wanted to get new ideas or to be inspired about ways that you can be involved in science communication. I think it was Russell earlier who said, keep it weird. Maybe you're inspired to embrace some of your inner weirdness and find science communication that can bring that out. Maybe you want to write a book like Norm someday, or you want to learn how to be a better ally or accomplice like we just heard about. Maybe you want to build community and culture around science communication. We've heard some talk today about how difficult it can be to get your advisor to be on board with you with taking the time to do science communication. I chose during graduate school to not tell my advisor when I was doing science communication, and that ended up being for the best. But I can tell you now that our science communication group has been in the department for about 4 years, the culture around it is changing. PIs are seeing that students can do science communication and not neglect their research, and that in fact it makes them better. And so I encourage you in your departments, build that culture. You might be a trailblazer, but make it easier for the people who come after you by starting now, even if you don't have to tell everybody what you're doing. Maybe you are already doing some science communication, but you want to expand upon it. You want to improve it, reach new audiences, emotionally engage with your audience. And maybe you're interested in non-academic careers. Most PhDs will not become faculty members, so a lot of us are going to find careers in different paths, and science communication feels really important at this moment, which I think was one of the things Norm started out by saying. But of course, you're in grad school, and you're busy, and everything is hard. You have advisor issues and money issues, and you have to take quals and, write your thesis and all of these tough things. So you've decided that science communication is important to you. You're here. You're aware of the challenges. What do you do now? How do you move forward? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the CLEAR project and what we do in the space of science communication, which maybe will give you some ideas. Maybe you can take something that we do and do it here. Maybe it just gives you an idea for something on your own that you want to run with. So we have 4 focus areas. We do CLEAR on campus, CLEAR in the community, CLEAR in the Capitol, and CLEAR in the classroom. So with CLEAR in the community, every second Saturday we show up at the Berkeley Farmers Market. We have a table, we do different demonstrations and experiments, and we've been doing it for 2 years. People know to look for us now, and they're excited to see what we have. My favorite, and I'm not just saying this to a Southern California audience, was the citrus booths that we've done, which Tracy was kind enough to send us some citrus for. I talked about citrus genomics, which was awesome. And we had volcanoes for kids to make out of citric acid and baking soda. Other topics we've had include fermented foods, plant pathology, astrobiology, fire ecology. We're definitely not experts in most of these topics. We try to bring somebody along who is. But honestly, just by spending half an hour on Wikipedia, you know a lot more than the general public. Not that that should be your main source for science communication. But if you're there and talking about something and sharing your enthusiasm, that will transfer to the people that you're talking to as much as what you're saying and specifically. We go to bars and do pub science. Once a month, we were lucky to have Norm come talk about his book in February on Valentine's Day for Sex on the Kitchen Table. We got somebody from SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the Lagunitas brewmaster, who talked about different yeast strains and how they change the flavors of beer. We've done some media creation. This is a picture of me and my sister-in-law. We went and worked on my friend's farm, and I was tired of my Bay Area hippie friends telling me about how they were just so tired of going to the office, and they just wanted a little piece of land to farm someday, and that would make their life so much simpler, and it would be so easy and wonderful. And so I spent some time on my friend's farm, and I called bullshit. So I wrote this 2-minute piece for our local NPR station, and they accept these 2-minute spots from community members. And I tried to dispel with that notion that farming is easy, because it is so hard. We made a video explaining the differences of monoculture and polyculture, and it took a little while to catch on YouTube. It's maybe 4 years old. We've got over, 10,000 views by now, which is, we're pretty happy with that. And I really recommend highly writing for the conversation if you're interested in science communication. The Conversation is an online news outlet, and they only accept writers with .edu email addresses. So they work with academics all the time. In fact, that's all they do. And you get to work with a professional editor who will really help you craft your piece into something special. I wrote one in October about organic farming and CRISPR, and I got a lot of attention, positive and negative, but from that also came an invitation to talk to the California Department of Food and Agriculture. I went on the radio in Wisconsin, and so by taking the time to do something like this, you can really amplify the work that you're doing, let other people know about it, and like Gustavo was saying, you get in the mind of a reporter so that they know who to call. Clear in the Classroom, we go to high school students and give an interactive lesson about CRISPR, but maybe CRISPR isn't your thing, maybe there's something else you want to go talk to them about. And if you can engage with them on that level and talk to students like they get to be part of the scientific process, and you're not there to tell them everything, but to say, hey, let's have a conversation about this. That's easy with CRISPR because it's going to affect their lives. And they need to talk and think about what CRISPR, how they want CRISPR to be a part of their lives, if they're okay with human editing, if they're not. But it will affect them, so it's important to bring them into conversations. And they really react well to being treated like that. Of course, science communication on campus is also really important. Like today, bringing people together. Training scientists to do science communication is absolutely essential. And then bringing in diverse communities within your campus to learn about science. Not everybody on campus is a scientist, and the same way I went to a Tale of Two Cities lecture at Berkeley and thought it was like the best seminar I'd ever been to. We can make seminars on our campus that appeal not only to academics outside of the scientists, but to the staff, the people who work in our greenhouses, all these different audiences right here on our own campuses. And also build a community around your science communication. With Clear, we meet on campus about once every 3 weeks on Friday afternoons. We have some snacks, we have some beverages, we usually have a speaker. Sometimes it's one of us, and sometimes it's somebody we bring from the outside. This was last Friday's meeting, and a first year in our group was giving a talk about CBD, cannabidiol, the cannabis compound. And we had a pretty packed room. It was a lot of fun, and I think we all learned quite a bit. And it's easier for us to talk to policymakers because it's a 90-minute drive for us, but that doesn't mean you can't do it here at Riverside, and that it's not just as important for you guys to engage with those people. So with all of these different awesome ways to get involved in science communication, I want to talk about a few lessons that I've learned and that our group has learned over the last couple of years. First thing is division of labor. It was said earlier by the science comedy show guys that you need a team. You need to work together. Not one person can do it all. And I think that's especially true in academia, where we are transient by nature. Graduate students come, graduate students go. Postdocs come, postdocs go. So if you build a science initiative, a communication initiative, all on your own shoulders, then it's probably going to leave when you do. So if you can create people around you who are invested in what you're doing, and when the new crop of first years come in, get them invested in what you're doing, then you can help build programs that last and initiatives that last and continue to improve your community. So along with that, support from fellow science communicators is crucial. Going to Berkeley farmers markets and talking about GMOs or vaccinations is terrifying, at least the first couple times. But knowing that you have somebody next to you who can kind of step in and say, you know, maybe who can kind of help diffuse a situation or answer a question that maybe you don't know the answer to is really helpful, and it can help you feel so much more comfortable going into situations that might be uncomfortable or awkward. Of course, get outside your comfort zone. And you do not need to know everything. I loved the podcasters talking earlier about how they love to talk about things that they actually don't know that much about, because then they get to go on the learning experience with their audience. And that makes you so much more human to your audience. It makes you relatable. And there's no best medium. I love the diversity of mediums for communicating science that we've talked about today. From podcasting to book writing to news to comedy. My goodness. So figure out what works for you and what feels good to you and what works with your time commitment. Because regardless of how you choose to communicate your work, you must communicate it. The stakes are too high, it's too important, and we all have a responsibility and a great privilege and opportunity to let people know about the awesome work that we're doing. And I'm really grateful to have been a part of CLEAR, and I am so happy and proud of what UCRiSC is. UCRiSC, is that how you say it? Or UCRiSC? I think it's so awesome what you guys are starting here and that everybody is here today. And so if ever I can be of any help, feel free to be in touch. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
I can talk really loud.
I'll repeat your question too.
Oh, thanks. Awesome. I really like the pub science thing. Was that something that came out of CLEAR, or was that kind of something that you guys absorbed from somewhere else, or kind of how did that come about?
So that started because we thought we were trying to figure out ways to take science to people. And we thought, where do people like to go? Well, people like to go to bars and drink beer. So our first attempt at pub science, we went to this popular bar in Oakland, kind of right around happy hour when all the young tech millennials were getting off of work. We held up signs that said, talk to a scientist, get free beer. Oh. So I had a pitcher of beer and a bunch of glasses, and somebody would come over and chat with me, and I'd just kind of fill up their glass, and we'd keep chatting about whatever they were interested in. And I thought that was so fun. I talked to so many people. I had one woman grab me by the arm and say, come to my table and tell everybody what you just told me. It's like, okay, sure. But that wasn't financially sustainable because somebody had to pay for the beer. And that was our group's advisor. Thank you, Peggy. But so we were trying to figure out, well, what else can we do? And we were a little hesitant to have speaker series because then you're asking people to go out of their way to attend a science event. And we've had some trouble getting enough people to show up sometimes. And it's kind of embarrassing when you have a great speaker there to talk about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And you have 15 people show up and most of them are from your own group. And it's like, oh gosh, is this even worth it? But I loved what the science comedy guys said earlier, that keep failing until you get it right. And we have been able to build up a pretty good following. We're not packing things, but we get a good audience now, and it's really fun. So yes, that was born out of our group.
I just wanted to add, I'm from San Diego, and the Fleet Science Center organizes two scientists walk into a bar. And so it's a way to get around. They were
Yeah, thanks guys. I was kind of interested in starting something like that at Riverside, and the hard thing just been one thing's just like finding a good place to do it, like a good bar, because it seems like Riverside campus is. I just moved here last month, so I'm very new to the area, but it seems like the downtown is like far from the campus, and there's not like really
Duke's
like.
is very affordable.
It's at Duke's. Oh, Duke's awesome.
Walking distance.
Well, one thing I'll say is that we intentionally make our pub science about 4 miles away from campus down in Oakland because we're not trying to target scientists or people necessarily on campus. We want to get the working population of Oakland. So there's some merit to being far away. Yeah.
Sorry if I didn't see it, but you mentioned several different cookie jars that queer put their hands into. Is there one that like they started from, like just the classroom, as you say, and then built up from there, or did you guys like start?
We started very slow. In fact, for the first year and a half we were in existence, the only thing that we did were campus events. Then the 2016 election happened, and we all got really freaked out and decided we need to step up our game. Regardless of your political affiliation, there was a lot of anti-science stuff going around. So that's when we started the farmers market, and about 6 months later, we started the pub science. It is not sustainable to try to do all of that at once. It's a lot, and we have maybe 30 members who regularly do stuff. The other thing I would say is that the main people of pub science, they never volunteer at farmers markets. And some of the main farmers markets people, they've never gone to the classroom. And that's okay, because everybody is so busy. You have to pick what you're passionate about and do that well. And don't try to spread yourselves too thin. It's just not sustainable. Especially if you have a busy semester or something, everything will kind of fall apart. So pick what you're passionate about, get a couple of people supporting you, but don't try to do it all at once. Okay. Well, thank you.
With that, thank you, Becky. Before you're free to go,